The level book lay open on the table with the wrong number written in it, in another man's hand. Eleanor Briggs was 33, and by 9 o'clock that morning she had been turned off without pay. Out on the bank, the ratepayers were laughing. No wages, no reference, no roof past the end of the month, and not one man who would say out loud that she could read a water gauge better than the engineer who signed the reports. In her apron pocket was a small brass folding rule with worn hinges, left to her by her father, an engine fitter named Josiah Briggs, dead 4 years. £9 6 shillings in back pay, and 30 days with a condemned pump house. But what Septimus Vane did not know was that at the river end of that pump house, under the silt in a stone chamber with a bent iron gate, something had been going wrong every single night for months. Something that would not only change what she was worth, it would change how much of Blackwater Fen was sown before winter. 11 hours before that book was taken away from her, the rain came down on the fen so hard that Eleanor could not hear the safety valve from 20 feet. It was the 14th of October, 1889. Thomas Pye had been firing since noon. Thomas was 58, a widower with a bad left knee and a way of setting his hand flat on the engine bed to feel what the machine was doing. He kept the fire high, and every hour Eleanor walked out to the iron footbridge with a lantern and read the board in the drain. At 10 o'clock the water in the drain stood at 2 feet 9 inches. At midnight it stood at 2 feet 11. At 2 in the morning it stood at 3 feet exactly, and Eleanor read it a second time in the rain, because a pump running at full speed for 8 hours was supposed to pull that number down, not push it up. She wrote the figure in the station book and the same figure in the small paper notebook she carried in her apron, the way her father had taught her, 1 hand for the master and 1 hand for yourself. By 6 the board read 3 feet 2. At 6:30 Thomas eased the engine back so he could get oil to the crank bearing, and the roar in the building dropped to a slow knocking. Eleanor was on the bridge with the lantern when the noise fell away, and in that lull she saw the reeds at the outfall lie down and swing the wrong way, back toward the building, and a rope of dirty foam come sliding in against the current with them. 3 men had shaped Eleanor Briggs's life, and only one of them had ever troubled to tell her she was right. Her father took her out on the fen jobs from the age of 8, because there was nobody at home to leave her with. Josiah Briggs mended threshing engines and drainage engines from Ely down to Littleport at 7 shillings a day and his lodging. Eleanor learned to count piston strokes against the second hand of his watch before she learned long division, and to read a staff gauge from the side, never from above, because water lies to you at an angle. On her 19th birthday he was 3 weeks into a cough that never left him, and he gave her the small brass folding rule out of his own pocket, still warm. "A number you keep to yourself is only an opinion," he said. She had kept the pocket notebook every working day since. By 7 the farmers were coming along the bank, because water was standing in the wheatland at Cole's Drove, and word travels fast in flat country. Miriam Cole got there first, 41, tenant of 94 acres, with 140 pounds of seedweed in her barn and no ground dry enough to put it in. Behind her came a boy of 9 named Alfred Sennett, who spent the whole hour throwing stones at a drowned hurdle. Septimus Vane arrived at 8 in a dog cart, in a black frock coat and boots too clean for the bank. He was 47, district engineer to the Blackwater Fen commissioners, and he did not raise his voice once. He looked at the water glass, looked at the coal, then picked up the station-level book off the table and carried it out into the light where everyone could see him holding it. He said the station had burned 1,100 weight of coal in the night, and the drain had risen 5 inches, and that both could not be true unless somebody had written the starting level down wrong. He read out the 10 o'clock entry. 2 feet 9. He said it must have been 2 feet 1, and that the clerk had copied her own figure across in the dark, and that on the corrected reading the machinery had performed exactly as it should. Nobody on that bank could check him. The book was in his hands. He told Eleanor her engagement was ended from that hour, and told Thomas Pye he was suspended without pay pending an inquiry. Then he put the level book under his arm and drove away with it. Eleanor stood in the doorway with the rain coming off the gutter behind her and did not answer him. When the cart was out of sight, she took the notebook out of her apron and turned to the page for the 14th. 10 o'clock. 2 feet 9. Her own hand in pencil, written wet. The commissioners met 4 days later in the upstairs room of the Swan at Little Denton, with 9 men round a table meant for 6. Vane read his report standing. The station was 21 years old, its boiler patched, its pump worn past economy. He recommended that it be closed, the engine and pump sold for their metal, and a new station built on the Denton Bank at £4,100, raised on the rates over 7 years. The scrapmen had already valued the ironwork at £230. Hugh Fenner, 62, farmed 600 acres at Fenner's Bank and paid more into the drainage rate than any man in the room. He asked how long a new station would take. Vane said 2 seasons, perhaps 3. Then who pumps this fen while we wait? Fenner said. Eleanor had come without being asked, and had stood at the back for 40 minutes with her bonnet in her hand. Ambrose Tuck, the commissioner's clerk, was 60 and had kept the minutes for 22 years, and he did not look up when she began, because he wrote everything twice and hated interruption. She said one thing only, and she said it as flatly as she could. 1,100 hundredweight of coal had gone through that boiler in 17 hours. Coal at that rate meant steam. Steam at that rate meant the engine had turned, and she had stood beside the pump at 3 in the morning and heard it throwing water. A worn-out machine does not eat 1,100 hundredweight of coal. It stops. So the coal had done work. The work had gone somewhere. And until somebody found out where, no figure in any report was worth the paper. The room did not warm to her, but Fenner turned his chair around. She asked for 30 days, access to the station, the right to run it, no wages, and her £9 6 shillings of unpaid pay standing as her bond. If she failed to bring the drain down, the scrapmen could come in on the 21st of November and she would go away with nothing. Vane said an unqualified person could not be given charge of a boiler under steam. Thomas Pye, in the doorway with his cap in both hands, said that he held the engine driver's certificate and would be running it, suspended or not. It came down to coal, because everything on that fen came down to coal. Miriam Cole worked the yard for 2 hours in the rain, and by dark she had 11 farmers' names on a half sheet, guaranteeing 12 tons between them, delivered as needed, payable at Christmas if the water came down, and never if it did not. The vote was 5-4. She got the keys on the 21st of October and started the inventory that same hour, on the back pages of the pocket notebook, because the station's own book was still in Vane's office in Ely. The pump house was a long building of red and yellow brick with a square chimney, put up in 1868 when the peat shrank so far that the old ditches would no longer run downhill on their own. That is the whole trouble with fen country. The fields end up lower than the water that is supposed to carry their rain away, and the only way to farm them is to lift that water uphill with a machine and hold it there. Inside, in the order she wrote them down. 1 Lancashire boiler, 40 years of fen water in it, weeping at 2 tube ends, the water spaces furred with scale. 1 horizontal condensing engine with a flywheel 14 feet across and a knock in the crank bearing you could hear from the coal wharf. 1 double inlet centrifugal pump, packing gone hard as horn. 1 suction well, 12 feet deep, half full of black water with a dead moorhen turning slowly in it. Then the far end, which was the part nobody at the Swan had talked about at all. The water the pump lifted did not go straight into the river. It went along a brick culvert to a stone chamber at the bank, and out through an opening hung with a great iron flap, a gate weighing the best part of half a ton, hinged along its top edge. When the pump pushed, the flap swung open and let the water out. When the pump stopped, it was supposed to fall shut, so that the river, sitting 4 or 5 feet higher than the drain, could not come back down the same road. That flap was the one thing in the station that had to work perfectly, and it was the one thing she could not see, because the river was up over it. What she could see was the wear. The sluice winding gear at the chamber head turned so stiffly that she needed both hands and her whole weight. The paint was gone off 9 feet of lifting chain, and the debris screen had collapsed on one corner and been left long enough for a willow to root in it. And leaning against the chamber wall, where somebody had put it down and never come back for it, was an iron bar 6 feet long, with the working end mushroomed flat from being beaten against something hard, over and over, for a long time. She wrote the bar down and did not know yet what it meant. A pump burns 1,100 hundredweight of coal, turns all night at working speed, and throws water hard enough to hear from 30 feet, and the fields go deeper under. Where did that water go? Eleanor had 4 weeks, 12 tons of borrowed coal, and no idea yet that the answer was already in her notebook, 3 lines above the moorhen. Samuel Reed was 24 and had the forge at Little Denton from his father, who had died in March owing £40 on a new bellows. He came out on the 22nd because Miriam Cole asked him to, and he stayed because Thomas Pye let him put his hand on the engine bed and feel the knock. The work went in this order. First the boiler, because nothing else could happen until it would hold steam. Samuel went in through the manhole with a lamp and a scraper, while Eleanor knelt outside and took the scale out in a bucket. It came away in curved gray plates like broken crockery, and they filled 9 buckets. The 2 weeping tube ends were beaded over with new ferrules from the ironmonger at Ely, 4 shillings and 8 pence the pair. Then the suction well. They lifted the grating, hooked out the moorhen, and dragged up 200 weight of leaves, sedge, a bicycle wheel, and a bag of rotten hemp rope. Eleanor wrote every item down. Thomas asked her why on earth she was writing down a bicycle wheel. "Because in 3 weeks somebody will tell me the well was clear," she said. Then the crank bearing. Thomas said the knock had been there since the spring, and that he had reported it twice. They took the brasses out and found the bottom one worn oval. Samuel scraped it back while Eleanor blued the shaft, taking the shims down a 32nd at a time, until it turned with an even bearing mark all round. Last, the pump packing. Eleanor drew the old rings out of the gland with a corkscrew tool and laid them on the bench in the order they came out. 6 of them, black and set as hard as horn, the innermost cracked right across. She looked at those rings for a long time. That was where the mistake began, though she did not know it for another 10 days. On the 25th, they lit the fire at 4 in the morning, warmed the boiler for 5 hours because Thomas would not be hurried, and at 9:15 turned the engine over with the pump uncoupled, running light. It ran for 11 minutes. There was the beat of the valve gear, the hiss of the gland, and underneath it nothing. No knock. Thomas stood with his palm flat on the bed and his eyes shut, and did not say anything at all, and Samuel started laughing and had to go outside. Eleanor wrote the time in the notebook and the coal, which was 200 weight and a half for the raising and the run. Kitty Mott, who was 30 and cleaned at the Swan, walked out that afternoon with a can of tea and left it on the bench without asking one question about the machinery. That evening the rain came on again, and Miriam sent word that the water was standing 4 inches deep in the bottom 8 acres at Coles Drove, and that she had 22 days. They coupled the pump and ran the first real test on the 27th of October from 8 in the morning until 2:30. Eleanor set herself on the footbridge with the notebook and read the drain board every 15 minutes. Thomas ran the engine at 32 revolutions, and by 9 the pump was throwing so hard that the water came out of the culvert mouth in a brown standing wave. At 8 the board read 3 feet 4. At 10 it read 3 feet 2.5. She wrote it down, and for about an hour she believed the whole thing was over. 1.5 inches in 2 hours. Keep that up for 3 days, and Miriam Cole would be drilling wheat by the first week of November. At noon it read 3 feet 1 3/4. By 1 o'clock it had not moved at all. At 2 the coal was down to the last of the second ton, and Thomas eased the engine back to 20 revolutions to hold what steam he had. Eleanor was standing at the chamber head when the note of the machine dropped and the building went quiet in stages. And then a new sound came up out of the brickwork, which was the sound of a great deal of water moving in the wrong direction. There was a grating in the chamber head, a foot square, so a man could look down into the culvert. She got down on her knees on the wet coping and put her face to the bars. Below her the water had been running out. Now it was running in. Leaves and a torn strip of sedge came past the grating going away from the river, sliding back toward the station, and behind them the surface heaved and swung and made a long, slow eddy against the brick. She counted 40 seconds of it, maybe 50, before it settled. Then she walked back out to the drain board and read it again. 3 feet 2. In 20 minutes, with the engine still turning, the drain had come back up half of everything they had taken out of it in 6 hours. Thomas came out and stood beside her, rubbing his knee with the flat of his hand the way he did when it was going to rain harder. "Where's it going then?" he said at last. "It isn't going anywhere," Eleanor said. "That's the trouble. Some of it's coming home." She spent the next 2 days convinced the fault was in the pump, and she can be forgiven for it, because everything she had ever been taught pointed that way. A centrifugal pump is a wheel in a case. It takes water in at the middle and slings it out at the rim, and it can only do that if the case is full and tight. Let air in past a worn packing and the wheel spins in froth and does half the work for all the coal. Her father had taken her to a job at Prickwillow when she was 14 where exactly that had happened, and the farmer was swearing at a machine in perfect order except for 6 shillings worth of hemp. So on the 28th she took £2 4 shillings of her own money, which was most of what she had in the world, and sent for square hemp packing and a new gland brass from Ely. The carrier who brought it out was Ernest Dow, 67, who had driven that road for 40 years and had never once been to Cambridge, though it is only 16 miles. They repacked the gland properly, 4 rings, joints staggered a quarter turn apart, drawn up gradually so as not to bind the shaft. Eleanor did the last ring herself, and wrote down the cost, the time, and the number of turns on each gland nut. Because a repair you cannot repeat is not a repair. They lit up on the 30th and ran 7 hours, and the pump was better. The wave coming out was heavier and steadier, the froth on the discharge was gone, and Thomas said the engine was pulling like a horse that had finally been fed. At 8 the drain board read 3 feet 3. At 3 in the afternoon it read 3 feet 1.5. 7 hours of hard steam, 2 tons of borrowed coal, and an inch and a half. The same inch and a half she had got from a worse pump 3 days before. Then Thomas shut down for the night, and this time the sound from the chamber head was not a slow eddy. It was a rush. It came up through the grating with a smell of river weed on it, and it went on for 2 full minutes, and when it stopped the drain board had come up 1.25 inches in under half an hour. Eleanor stood on the coping with her lantern and understood one thing very clearly, and it was not the answer. The harder she pumped, the harder the water came back. That is not how a leaking pump behaves. A leaking pump is feeble. This machine was strong, and something at the other end of its work was taking half of it away, and taking more of it the better she made the pump. She wrote the 2 readings side by side, put a line under them, and sat down on an upturned bucket in the dark with the lantern between her boots. 16 days left. 2 pounds 4 shillings gone. 4 tons of the farmer's coal burned. And the water in Miriam Cole's bottom 8 acres had not gone down at all. The river fell 4 days later. It had been dry since the 2nd of November. The ooze commissioners had drawn their upstream sluices for repairs at Littleport, and on the morning of the 6th the main channel stood lower than anyone had seen it since August. They wound the chamber sluice down, which took Samuel and Thomas together on the handles, then bailed and pumped for 5 hours, and at 2 in the afternoon got the ladder in, and went down into a stone room that had not been dry since 1886. The first thing was the smell. The second thing was the floor, because there was not supposed to be one. The chamber should have been open brick to the bottom, and instead there was 18 inches of silt across the whole width of it, black and heavy as wet clay, with sticks and a length of barbed wire set in it like currants in a cake. The great iron flap hung above all that on its top hinge, and even with the river down and nothing pushing it, it hung open. Not wide. About the width of a man's hand at the bottom corner. Eleanor got the lantern up against the frame and read it the way her father had taught her to read any piece of worn iron, which is to look for where it is bright. The hinge strap on the left side had been pulled and twisted so that the gate hung out of square by 1.5 inches. The oak blocks it was supposed to shut against were split along the grain, and one had lost its face altogether. And all across the bottom rail, in a band of polished metal, were the marks of the flap coming down again and again on the same wrong corner. She took the brass rule out of her apron and measured the gap at the bottom corner, 1 3/4 inches at rest. Then she measured the silt and worked it out loud, in the plainest words she had, because Samuel had never seen the inside of a drainage station before that month. The pump lifts the water and pushes it out through this room. The flap opens to let it go. Then the pump eases, and the flap is supposed to drop shut and stop the river coming back down the pipe, because the river out there sits 4.5 feet above the drain. This flap cannot drop shut. It is bent, its seat is broken, and it is sitting on 1.5 feet of mud. So every time the engine slowed, 4.5 feet of river came in through a gap the size of a letterbox and ran back down the culvert into the suction well, and the pump picked it up and lifted it out again, and burned coal doing it, and the fen kept filling. Thomas said one word quietly, then went up the ladder and came back with the 6-foot iron bar that had been leaning against the chamber wall. He had used it, he said, 2 summers running. Whenever the river was low, he had come down here and beaten that gate onto its seat, because it was the only thing that made any difference, and he had told the engineer about it twice. That evening Miriam Cole went through the commissioner's minute book in the back room of the Swan with Ambrose Tuck watching her like a dog, and found the entry for the 11th of March. Continued knocking reported at the Blackwater outfall. Referred to the district engineer. And Eleanor, in the station's own letter file, found the requisition that had gone in with it. She had written it herself. Renewal of outfall flap seating and hinge strap estimated 11 pounds, urgent before the autumn rains. Across the bottom, in a small controlled hand, were 3 words and 2 initials. Deferred. Not necessary. SV. The proper repair was the one she had costed in March. A new hinge strap, a new pin, new seating, 11 pounds. She had 4 shillings and 9 pence. So they did what people do when they have 12 days and no money. They cleared the chamber first, 2.5 days of it, barrow by barrow up a plank, 41 barrow loads tipped out onto the bank where they stand to this day. Miriam sent her cowman, a Welshman named Owen Pritchard, 49, who worked 11 hours without speaking except to ask where the tea was. Under the mud, the floor turned out to be sound brick, hardly worn. Then Eleanor made her second mistake, and it was worse than the first. She could not straighten the hinge without a forge fire on the spot, and a week she did not have. So she left the bent gate where it was, and made the seat come to meet it. Samuel got an old driving belt from the mill at Little Denton for 4 shillings, and they cut leather bolsters and tacked them onto the split oak, and behind them set 2 timber shores wedged against the far wall, so that when the flap came down the leather would squash into the gap and the shores would hold it against the frame. On paper it was reasonable. She had thought of it as a gate, and a gate is a thing that weighs half a ton, and half a ton of iron with 2 oak shores behind it felt like plenty. That is not what she was fighting. The opening was 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, and the river stood 4.5 feet above it, and water pushing on 12 square feet of surface at that depth comes to better than 1.5 tons of steady dead push. All day, all night, never tiring. She had not done that sum. She had never had to. They tested on the 10th of November with the river coming up on a north wind. Thomas ran the engine to full speed for 40 minutes, with the flap held open by the discharge, and then, on Eleanor's word, began to ease her down slowly to see the seal take. At the moment the discharge dropped away, the river found the leather. The first sound was a hiss, very thin, like a kettle a long way off. Then the leather split from the tack line down, all at once, and the water came through in a jet that took Samuel across the shins and knocked his lamp into the silt. The near shore kicked out of its wedge and went end over end down the chamber, and the flap, with nothing holding it and 1.5 tons behind it, came off the seat and slammed onto the frame with a noise they heard in the engine house 40 yards away. Samuel got his shoulder against the ladder stringer and his arm came out of the way perhaps a second before the shore came past it. They got him up. He had a bruise from the collarbone to the elbow that went black by evening, and no more than that. 11 days left. 4 shillings and 9 pence gone to 4 pence. And Eleanor sat on the bank in the wet with her notebook shut on her knee, because there was nothing in it worth writing. She told them the truth the next morning in the forge doorway at Little Denton, because Samuel could not lift his left arm above his chest and she was the reason. She had built the repair to hold up a gate. She should have built it to hold back a river. The number was 1.5 tons. She had never put it on paper, and if she had, she would not have sent a man down a ladder behind 2 wedges and a strip of belting. Samuel said he had made the bolsters and never once asked her what was going to push on them. Then he said the better thing. Stop patching, take the bent strap off, and let him forge a new one out of one piece. They did it in 4 days. Miriam went round the drove again with the same half sheet and came back with £7.12 from 9 farmers, one of them Robert Sennett, whose boy threw stones at hurdles, and whose 11 acres of wheat land lay under water. Hugh Fenner sent 2 baulks of oak out of a lock gate broken up at Denton in 1884, seasoned hard as iron. Samuel charged £2.08 for iron and coke and nothing for his time. The new hinge strap came out of the fire in one piece, 3 inches by 5/8, bolted through the top rail in 6 places, with a pin turned a full inch and a quarter and a collar to stop it walking out. It weighed 31 pounds. When they hung the gate on it, the flap swung true and sat down on its frame with nothing showing at any corner. The seat they made in 4 blocks, bolted from inside the chamber so that when the oak wore, a man could put a new block in without touching the hinge, and she made Samuel cut the bolt heads to a size the station's own spanner would fit, because a repair that needs a tool you have not got is not a repair either. The screen they hung in grooves, so it lifts out with a boat hook and goes back in under a minute. And then, last, Eleanor did the thing that nobody had asked her for. She had 2 boards made, painted white, marked in inches and numbered large enough to read from the footbridge. One went into the drain, one into the river, both set to the same datum, and from that day every reading in her notebook was 2 numbers taken in the same minute, the drain and the river, side by side. Because a station is not proved by how much smoke it makes. It is proved by the difference between those 2 boards, and by how that difference behaves when the engine slows. They ran the moderate test on the 15th of November, 6 hours, river 2 feet 9 above the drain. The drain fell 2 3/8 inches. At 2:30, Thomas eased the engine right down, and up in the chamber the flap came over and knocked once and stayed. Eleanor stood at the grating for 20 minutes with her watch open. The water below her did not come back. Word of the 15th got to Ely by the 16th, because Owen Pritchard told the blacksmith's boy. Vane did not come out to the fen. He wrote 3 letters. The first went to Sheffens and Son, coal merchants of Ely, noting that the station stood condemned by resolution of the commissioners, held no authorized account, and that any coal delivered there was delivered at the merchant's own risk. Sheffens stopped the last 4 tons the same afternoon. The second went to the commissioners. Structural alterations had been carried out on their property without authorization or engineer's approval, by persons not qualified to carry them out, and 1 man had already been injured. He submitted that the 30-day agreement was void, and that in the interest of public safety the demolition inspection should be brought forward to the 18th. The third went to Thomas Pye, and reminded him in 4 polite lines that his suspension remained in force, and that his pension of £18 a year was a matter for the commissioner's discretion. Thomas read that one twice, folded it, put it in the fire, and went back out and greased the crosshead. Eleanor took the second letter to Hugh Fenner at Fenner's Bank on the 17th, and she did not say one word about the initials at the bottom of the March requisition. She had learned something in that chamber that had nothing to do with iron, which was that a person who tells a committee they have been lied to gets an argument, and a person who tells a committee they can come and watch gets a date. So she asked for the date. 1 test, she said. Conditions set by the commissioners, not by her. Coal weighed by them and sealed by them. Boards read by them, out loud in front of everybody, at fixed times. If the water did not come down, they could have the station and her bond and be done with it. Fenner wrote the terms in his own hand at the kitchen table, and Ambrose Tuck copied them twice. The test would be on the 20th of November, 7 in the morning, 6 hours. The engine driven by Thomas Pye at a steady speed and eased down twice during the run, at the commissioner's word, without warning. Coal to be that already on the wharf, weighed and sealed the night before. Both boards read every half hour by 2 men appointed on the day. The drain to fall 3 inches, net, at the end of 6 hours. 3 inches, or the scrap men came. That night Thomas weighed what was on the wharf. 2 tons 11 hundredweight, most of it slack. Enough for 1 run, not enough for 2. It rained for 31 hours on the 18th and 19th of November, which was the best luck Eleanor Briggs had all that autumn, because it meant nobody could say afterward that the test had been run on an easy day. By dark on the 19th, the drain was up to 3 feet 7, and the river was over the top of the outfall by more than 4 feet. Hugh Fenner came out at 6 that evening with a spring balance, and he and Ambrose Tuck weighed the coal, covered it with a tarpaulin, and ran a cord across it with sealing wax on the knots. Then Fenner checked the numbering on the drain board with his own 2-foot rule, and made a saw cut in the post at the 7 o'clock line, so that nobody could shift a board in the night. 22 people came out on the 20th. 7 commissioners, 11 farmers, Miriam Cole, Samuel Reed with his left arm still stiff, Kitty Mott from the Swan, and Septimus Vane in his black coat and clean boots, standing on the dry side of the footbridge with his hands behind his back. The appointed readers were Walter Kime, 38, of Denton Mill, who read the drain, and Ambrose Tuck, who read the river. They read aloud on the half hour, and Tuck wrote both numbers in the minute book while Eleanor wrote the same 2 numbers in her notebook in pencil in front of everyone. Thomas lit the fire at 4 in the morning and had steam at 10 minutes to 7. At 7 o'clock the boards read 3 feet 7 in the drain and 7 feet 9 in the river. The engine went to work. For the first hour nothing happened that anybody could see, and Vane stood very still. Water does not move fast. 1,400 acres of fen does not empty because a wheel is spinning. At 8 the drain read 3 feet 6. At 9 it read 3 feet, 4.5. At 20 minutes to 10 Fenner said, without any warning, ease her. Thomas took the engine down to a walk. The roar came off the building, the discharge died back, and every person on that bank went to the chamber head to look through the grating, and Vane went with them, because he had to. There was a knock from below. 1, heavy, iron on oak. Then nothing. No hiss. No rope of foam. No leaves sliding home the wrong way. The water in the culvert stood there with the river 4 feet above it, and did not come in. They ran on. At 11 the drain read 3 feet 2.5, and the river had come up 1.5 inches in the meantime, which meant the pump was working against more head than it had started with, and the board said so in Tuck's own handwriting. Fenner called the second easing at 12:10. Same knock, same nothing. At 1 o'clock, Walter Kime read the drain board twice before he said it out loud. 3 feet 2 3/4. 4¼ inches, net, in 6 hours, against a rising river, on 2 tons 300 weight of sealed coal, with the engine eased twice at the commissioner's word. The target had been 3. Vane did the only thing left to him. He opened the station-level book, the one he had carried away in the dogcart on the 15th of October, and said, quite calmly, that this proved nothing about the night in question, because on that night the riverhead had been extraordinary, and the corrected starting level of 2 feet 1 was in the book in his own hand. Eleanor had been waiting 5 weeks for him to say that number out loud in front of witnesses. She asked Thomas Pye one question, and Thomas answered it standing in the doorway of his own engine house with his cap on. The suction inlet in that well sits at 2 feet 6 on the same boards everyone had been reading all morning. Below 2 feet 6 the pump takes air and throws nothing at all. Any man who has driven it knows that. So the engineer's corrected figure put the water 5 inches below the pump's own mouth, on a night when his report said the machinery had performed exactly as it should. Both of those could not be true. And then, one after another, the rest of it came out onto the bridge rail in front of the commissioners. Her pocket notebook, in pencil, with the 14th of October reading 2 feet 9 at 10 o'clock. Sheffen's tally for 1,100 weight of coal. The mud line in the outfall chamber, which anybody could go down and look at, 4 inches lower than the head he claimed. The minute of the 11th of March about the knocking at the Blackwater outfall. And the requisition, 11 pounds, urgent before the autumn rains, with 3 words across the bottom. Deferred. Not necessary. SV. Fenner read that one twice, the second time aloud. The commissioners rejected the demolition recommendation that afternoon, 8-1, and instructed Tuck to open an inquiry into the district engineer's records and his deferred maintenance. Vane put the level book down on the bridge rail and left it there. He walked back along the bank to the dogcart in his clean boots, passed every one of them, and he did not say a single word to anybody, and that was the best part of the whole day. The water went off Cole's drove in 9 days. Miriam Cole drilled 41 acres of wheat between the 2nd and the 6th of December, late but in. Across the district, the station held about 1,800 acres through that winter, and 600 of those acres went under seed that would not have gone in at all if the scrap men had come on the 21st. The commissioners paid what they owed, because Fenner made them do it item by item at the January meeting. Thomas Pye had his suspension lifted, and £9 15 of back pay. Samuel Reed was paid £2.8 for iron and coke and another £4 for his work, and put half of it against his father's bellows. Eleanor Briggs was paid her £9 6. Then they gave her the station. Not as a gift. A seasonal operating contract, December to April, renewable, with a crew of 3 and a coal allowance, and her own title written into the minute in Ambrose Tuck's careful hand. Operating Superintendent, Blackwater Fen Steam Drainage Station. Vane's inquiry ran until March. He was not prosecuted for anything. He resigned his district appointment in February and took work with a contractor in Lincolnshire, and Eleanor never saw him again. On the first morning of the contract, she walked out to the footbridge at 7 o'clock with a new level book under her arm, the pages still stiff. There was frost on the handrail and the fen was the color of a pewter dish. She read the drainboard and the riverboard in the same minute, the way she had made everybody read them since the 15th of November, and she took the small brass folding rule out of her apron to check the 1/4 inch, because the light was bad, and a number is worth nothing if you guess at it. Her father had told her that a number she kept to herself was only an opinion. It had taken her 33 years and 1 flooded autumn to learn the rest of it, which is that a number other people can watch you take is something else entirely. She opened the book and wrote the date, the 2 readings, the coal, and the hour. Then she signed the entry with her own name and went in to light the fire.